What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, if that is the sort of thing that you are interested in, and if you want to be just as informed as my clients, maybe consider subscribing. Everyone else, what's up, guys? How you guys doing? I'm filming this on Thursday night. Tomorrow I have a business trip, and then I'm taking 2 days off to visit rural Jiangxi, which is a part of the country in the south. Very beautiful part of rural China. I'm going to be there for a couple of days. Maybe if I can film some of the area with my amateur filming skills, I'll throw them up for you guys to see. It's a very gorgeous part of the country. My hope is that my hotel will have sufficiently good internet that I can upload them. If the internet is not good enough, it's going to be a rural part of the country, a little poorer, less infrastructure investment there than the major cities. Then I'm probably going to have to wait until Sunday when I get back to upload it. So if this comes up on Sunday, I'm sorry for the wait on that one. This episode is also going to be very international heavy. We're going to be looking a lot at the US-China relationship, because there have been some big developments from the US side in terms of their China policy. There's been some new articulations that bring some clarity to the nature of the US-China relationship from the US perspective under the Biden administration. So this is going to be a very heavy international episode. As always, guys, if you enjoy the content, I'm a small new YouTuber, so it's a huge help if you smash the like button. If you enjoy the content, share with anyone who is interested in following China developments from a more of an analytical and a macro sort of perspective. And as always, a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for all your support, supporting a new YouTube channel. It is always very humbling. Now, with all that said and done, let's jump into this week's China Update. Leading theoretical journal of the party, 九事, or Seeking Truth journal, this week published a speech that General Secretary Xi Jinping made in 2018 to the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Engineering, in which he called on China to, quote, strive to become the world's major scientific center and innovation high ground. The publication of this speech now, 2 years later, is likely to coincide with the technology goals of the 14th five-year plan, from 2021 to 2025, and the 2035 long-term objectives, thus giving more political force behind these two longer-term objectives that were published during the Lianghui, or two sessions, a few weeks back. He wrote, quote, if China wants to be strong and rejuvenated, it must vigorously develop science and technology and strive to become the world's major scientific center and innovation highland. We are closer to the goal of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation than at any time in history, and we need to build a world power in science and technology more than any time in history. End quote. The article will be required reading for cadres across the country and was also presented to a general audience, receiving attention in state-run evening news that millions of people watched earlier the week on Monday night. So what are the objectives, the technological and scientific objectives of the 14th five-year plan and the 2035 long-term objectives? Well, along with promoting things like innovation and basic scientific research, the plan also identifies 7 frontiers that China must lead in the future. These are identified as next-generation artificial intelligence, quantum information, integrated circuits, neuroscience and brain-like research, genetics and biotechnology, clinical medicine and health, and deep space, deep earth, deep sea, and polar exploration. This week, US Secretary of State Blinken and Defense Secretary Austin made their first international trip, and it was to Japan and South Korea, sending a strong signal of US intent and geopolitical priorities. To ensure there was no ambiguity, the two top Biden officials penned an opinion piece in the Washington Post before the trip to explain the US position. With this opinion, we can see a very clear articulation of US Asia policy, especially vis-a-vis China, from the Biden White House. They wrote, quote, there's another reason we've made this part of the world the site of our first in-person travel as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. The Indo-Pacific region is increasingly the center of global geopolitics. It is home to billions of the world's people, several established and rising powers, and 5 of America's treaty allies. Plus, a great deal of the world's trade travels through its sea lanes. It is strongly in our interests for the Indo-Pacific region to be free and open, anchored by respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. This is a goal that Japan, South Korea, and the United States share, and we will work together closely to achieve it. They went on to write, quote, not all countries share this vision. Some seek to challenge the international order, that is, the rules, values, and institutions that reduce conflict and make cooperation possible among nations. As countries in the region and beyond know, China in particular is all too willing to use coercion to get its way. Here again, we see how working with our allies is critical. Our combined power makes us stronger when we must push back against China's aggression and threats. Together, we will hold China accountable when it abuses human rights in Xinjiang and Tibet, systematically erodes autonomy in Hong Kong, undercuts democracy in Taiwan, or asserts maritime claims in the South China Sea that violate international law. If we don't act decisively and lead, Beijing will. End quote. Like I said, a very clear articulation here of the US position vis-a-vis its Asia policy and China specifically. Next week, we will be discussing in depth the talks between Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, as well as these two US secretaries. I think there will be a lot to discuss, and I think there's probably going to be a lot coming out of that meeting, as well as posturing from both sides towards a domestic audience. So we'll be discussing that in depth next week. While we're still on US-China, there was also another very important meeting, and that was the so-called Quad meeting. We saw the Quad Leaders Summit this week, where leaders from India, Japan, the US, and Australia met to discuss the developing initiative. In a joint statement, the leaders expressed, quote, "We will begin cooperation on the critical technologies of the future to ensure that innovation is consistent with a free, open, inclusive, and resilient Indo-Pacific. We will continue to prioritize the role of international law in the maritime domain, particularly as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and facilitate cooperation, including in maritime security, to meet challenges to the rules-based maritime order in the East and South China Seas." End quote. It was also announced this week that Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga will visit the US in the first half of April at the earliest for a meeting with President Joe Biden. PRC state media and government officials have hit back against the statements made this week. Quote, "For the South China Sea to Taiwan to the Diaoyu Islands, all of these questions are related to China's sovereignty and core interests, where China has no room to make compromises, and provocations from the US and its allies in the region have often created critical opportunities for China to find new solutions." End quote. End quote. For quite some time, certain countries have been so keen to exaggerate and hype up the so-called China threat to sow discord among regional countries, especially to disrupt their relations with China. End quote. Now, while we are here, Kurt Campbell, the Biden White House so-called Asia czar, spoke to the Sydney Morning Herald this week about the US position on the China-Australia trade dispute, saying, quote, "We have made clear that the US is not prepared to improve relations in a bilateral and separate context at the same time that a close and dear ally is being subjected to a form of economic coercion." End quote. Now, for the quote of the week this week, I have two quotes that I want to discuss, both from Chinese academics. The first is from Yan Peng, head of the highly influential think tank associated with the Ministry of State Security, the 中国现代国际关系研究院, or the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. He said this week, quote, "Compared with the rise and fall of great powers in history, there is more of a socialist and capitalist contest between China and the United States, and a clash of civilizations between East and West, making the relationship between China and the United States more profound and complex than any other rise and fall of great powers in history, and the impact produced is more far-reaching." End quote. The next quote is from a far less influential academic, but still an important voice in academic debate on the mainland. He wrote this week, quote, "Beijing is looking at speeding up the resolution of the Taiwan issue during Xi's third term as president. This means that over the next 5 years, the Taiwan issue will become the most important story in the Western Pacific. It is a focal issue that will trigger clashes in Sino-US relations sooner rather than later, and will be a flashpoint for Sino-US conflict." End quote. This week, the UK formally declared that the PRC is in breach of the 1984 Hong Kong Declaration. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab expressed, quote, "Radical changes planned by Beijing to restrict participation in Hong Kong elections represented a further clear breach of the legally binding declaration." End quote. A G7 statement published by the US State Department expressed similar sentiment. The PRC response was as expected, quote, "The so-called China breaches the Sino-British joint declaration is a non-issue. The Chinese government governs Hong Kong in accordance with the Constitution and the Basic Law, not the Joint Declaration. The core content of the Joint Declaration is to ensure China resumes exercise of sovereignty over Hong Kong. Its historical mission was completed at handover. The UK has no sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of supervision over Hong Kong after the handover, and it has no so-called obligations to Hong Kong citizens. End quote. While we're here, let's remind ourselves once again what the dominant narrative is domestically here in the mainland regarding the Hong Kong protests in 2019. How is this framed politically here for a domestic audience? This piece from state-run Xinhua this week is a fairly representative rendering of the dominant narrative presented here. Quote, "The illegal activities that were once rampant in Hong Kong to seek so-called Hong Kong independence, organize riots, and instigate suicidal violence were directly related to the overt or covert supports from some Western countries," the spokesperson said, adding that it is an open secret that a few Western countries have a hidden political agenda behind their interference in Hong Kong's affairs under the disguise of freedom and democracy. End quote. And finally, again, another international story regarding China, but important in terms of macro development for China. EU sanctions. On Wednesday, the European Union announced that it was to blacklist Chinese officials for, quote, human rights abuses, end quote. These represent the first sanctions against Beijing since EU arms embargoes in 1989. 4 PRC nationals and 1 entity will receive travel bans and asset freezes. The state media response in the mainland was that the sanctions were due to US pressure and misinformation. Quote, "Sanctions imposed on China on Wednesday by the EU in the name of human rights concerns are a new example of how the bloc was pressured by the US and some internal anti-China groups to use misinformation on Xinjiang as a weapon to target China." End quote. Okay guys, that was this week's China update. It's a little shorter because I'm doing this on Thursday, like I said. Hopefully you guys will get this on Friday, otherwise it will be up on Sunday. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to smash that like button, share, all that good stuff. Comment below, I'd love to hear from you guys. Wherever you are, stay safe, stay sane. I will see you guys next time on China Update.